Happy Wednesday, 8th graders. We will continue with The Book Thief. We are on The Collector. Neither Hans Huberman nor Alex Steiner was sent to fight. Alex was sent to Austria to an army hospital outside Vienna. Given his expertise in tailoring, he was given a job that at least resembled his profession. Cartloads of uniforms and socks and shirts would come in every week, and he would mend what needed mending, even if they could only be used as underclothes for the suffering soldiers in Russia. Hans was sent first, quite ironically, to Stuttgart and later to Essen. He was given one of the most undesirable positions on the home front, the LSE. A necessary explanation: LSE, Luftwaffe Sondereinheit, Air Raid Special Unit. The job of the LSE was to remain above ground during air raids and put out fires, prop up the walls of buildings, and rescue anyone who had been trapped during the raid. As Hans soon discovered, there was also an alternative definition for the acronym. The man in the unit would explain to him on his first day that it really stood for Leichensammler Einheit, dead body collectors. When he arrived, Hans could only guess what those men had done to deserve such a task, and in turn, they wondered the same of him. Their leader, Sergeant Boris Schipper, asked him straight out. When Hans explained the bread, the Jews, and the whip, the round faced sergeant gave out a short spurt of laughter. You're lucky to be alive. His eyes were also round, and he was constantly wiping them. They were either tired or itchy or full of smoke and dust. Just remember that the enemy here is not in front of you. Hans was about to ask the obvious question when a voice arrived from behind. Attached to it was the slender face of a young man with a smile like a sneer. Reinhold Zucker. With us, he said. The enemy isn't over the hill or in any specific direction. It's all around. He returned his focus to the letter he was writing. You'll see. In the messy space of a few months, Reinhold Zucker would be dead. He would be killed by Hans Huberman's seat. As the war flew into Germany with more intensity, Hans would learn that every one of his shifts started in the same fashion. The men would gather at the truck to be briefed on what had been hit during their break, what was most likely to be hit next, and who was working with whom. Even when no raids were in operation, there would still be a great deal of work to be done. They would drive through broken towns, cleaning up. In the truck, there were 12 slouched men, all rising and falling with the various inconsistencies in the road. From the beginning, it was clear that they all owned a seat. Reinhold Zucker's was in the middle of the left row. Hans Huberman's was at the very back, where the daylight stretched itself out. He learned quickly to be on the lookout for any rubbish that might be thrown from anywhere in the truck's interior. Hans reserved a special respect for cigarette butts, still burning as they whistled by. A complete letter home. To my dear Rosa and Liesel, everything is fine here. I hope you are both well. With love, Papa. In late November, he had his first smoky taste of an actual raid. The truck was mobbed by rubble, and there was much running and shouting. Fires were burning and ruined cases of buildings were piled up in mounds. Framework leaned. The smoke bombs stood like matchsticks in the ground, filling the city's lungs. Hans Huberman was in a group of four. They formed a line. Sergeant Boris Schipper was at the front, his arms disappearing into the smoke. Behind him was Kessler, then Brunenweg, then Huberman. As the sergeant hosed the fire, the other two men hosed the sergeant, and just to make sure, Huberman hosed all three of them. Behind him, a building groaned and tripped. It fell face first, stopping a few meters from his heels. The concrete smelled brand new, and the wall of powder rushed at them. Gottverdammt, Huberman. The voice struggled out of the flames. It was followed immediately by three men. Their throats were filled with particles of ash. Even when they made it around the corner, away from the center of the wreckage, the haze of the collapsed building attempted to follow. It was white and warm, and it crept behind them. Slumped in temporary safety, there was much coughing and swearing. The sergeant repeated his earlier sentiments. God damn it, Huberman! He scraped at his lips to loosen them. What the hell was that? It just collapsed right behind us. That much I know already. The question is, how big was it? It must have been 10 stories high. No, sir, just two, I think. Jesus! A coughing fit. Mary and Joseph. Now he yanked at the paste of sweat and powder in his eye sockets. Not much you could do about that. One of the other men wiped his face and said, Just once, I want to be there when they hit a pub, for Christ's sake. I'm dying for a beer. Each man leaned back. They could all taste it, putting out the fires in their throats and softening the smoke. It was a nice dream and an impossible one. They were all aware that any beer that flowed in the streets would not be beer at all, but a kind of milkshake or porridge. All four men were plastered with a gray and white conglomeration of dust. When they stood up fully to resume work, only small cracks of their uniform could be seen. The sergeant walked to Brunenweg. He brushed heavily at his chest. Several smacks. That's better. You had some dust on there, my friend. As Brunenweg laughed, the sergeant turned to his newest recruit. You first this time, Huberman. They put the fires out for several hours, and they found anything else they could to convince a building to remain standing. In some cases where the sides were damaged, the remaining edges poked out like elbows. This was Hans Huberman's strong point. He almost came to enjoy finding a smoldering rafter or disheveled slab of concrete to prop those elbows up, to give them something to rest on. His hands were packed tightly with splinters, and his teeth were caked with residue from the fallout. Both lips were set with moist dust that had hardened, and there wasn't a pocket, a thread, or a hidden crease in his uniform that wasn't covered in a film left by the loaded air. The worst part of the job was the people. Once in a while, there was a person roaming doggedly through the fog, mostly single worded. They always shouted a name. Sometimes it was Wolfgang. Have you seen my Wolfgang? Their handprints would remain on his jacket. Stephanie, Hansi, Gustel, Gustel Stoby. As the density subsided, the roll call of names limped through the ruptured streets, sometimes ending with an ash-filled embrace or a knelt-down howl of grief. They accumulated, hour by hour, like sweet and sour dreams, waiting to happen. The dangers merged into one: powder and smoke and the gusty flames. The damaged people. Like the rest of the men in the unit, Hans would need to perfect the art of forgetting. How are you, Huberman? The sergeant asked at one point. Fire was at his shoulders. Hans nodded uneasily at the pair of them. Midway through the shift, there was an old man who staggered defenselessly through the streets. As Hans finished stabilizing the building, he turned to find at his back, waiting calmly for his turn. The blood stain was signed across his face. It trailed off down his throat and neck. He was wearing a white shirt with a dark red collar, and he held his leg as if it was next to him. Could you prop me up now, young man? Hans picked him up and carried him out of the haze. A small sad note. I visited that small city street with the man still in Hans Huberman's arms. The sky was white horse gray. It wasn't until he placed him down on a patch of concrete coated grass that Hans noted. What is it? One of the other men asked. Hans could only point. Oh, a hand pulled away. Get used to it, Huberman. For the rest of the shift, he threw himself into duty. He tried to ignore the distant echoes of calling people, and perhaps 2 hours, he rushed from the building with the sergeant and two other men. He didn't watch the ground and tripped. Only when he returned to his haunches and saw the others looking in distress at the obstacle did he realize. The corpse was face down. It lay in a blanket of powder and dust, and it was holding its ears. It was a boy, perhaps 11 or 12 years old. Not far away, as they progressed along the street, they found a woman calling the name Rudolph. She was drawn to the four men and met them in the mist. Her body was frail and bent with worry. Have you seen my boy? How old is he? The sergeant asked. 12. Oh, Christ. Oh, crucified Christ. They all thought it, but the sergeant could not bring himself to tell her or point the way. As the woman tried to push past, Boris Shipper held her back. We've just come from that street, he assured her. You won't find him down there. The bent woman still clung to hope. She called over her shoulder as she half walked, half ran. Rudy! Hod's human thought of another Rudy then. The Himmel Street variety. Please, he asked into a sky he couldn't see. Let Rudy be safe. His thoughts naturally progressed to Liesel and Rosa and the Steiners and Max. When they made it to the rest of the men, he dropped down and lay on his back. How was it down there? Somewhere asked. Papa's lungs were full of sky. A few hours later, when he'd washed and eaten and thrown up, he attempted to write a detailed letter home. His hands were uncontrollable, forcing him to make it short. If he could bring himself, the remainder would be told verbally when and if he made it home. To my dear Rosa and Liesel, he began. It took many minutes to write those 6 words down. Next chapter is The Bread Eaters. It had been a long and eventful year in mulching, and it was finally drawing to a close. Liesel spent the last few months of 1942 consumed by thoughts of what she called 3 desperate men. She wondered where they were and what they were doing. One afternoon, she lifted the accordion from its case and polished it with a rag. Only once, just before she put it away, did she take the step that Mamma could not. She placed her finger on one of the keys and softly pumped the elbows. Rosa had been right. It only made the room feel emptier. Whenever she met Rudy, she asked if there was any word from her father. Sometimes he described to her in detail one of Alex Steiner's letters. By comparison, the one letter her own papa had sent was somewhat of a disappointment. Max, of course, was entirely up to her imagination. It was with great optimism that she envisioned him walking alone on a deserted road. Once in a while she imagined him falling into a doorway of safety somewhere, his identity card enough to fool the right person. The 3 men would turn up everywhere. She saw her papa in the window at school. Max often sat with her by the fire. Alex Steiner arrived when she was with Rudy, staring back at them after they'd slammed the bikes down on Munich Street and looked into the shop. Look at those suits, Rudy would say to her, his head and hands against the glass. All going to waste. Strangely, one of Liesel's favorite distractions was Frau Holzefeld. The reading sessions included Wednesday now as well, and they'd finished the water abridged version of The Whistler and were on to The Dream Carrier. The old woman sometimes made tea and gave Liesel some soup that was infinitely better than Mama's. Less watery. Between October and December, there had been one more parade of Jews, with one to follow. And on the previous occasion, Liesel had rushed to Munich Street, this time to see if Max Vandenberg was among them. She was torn between the obvious urge to see him, to know that he was still alive, and an absence that could mean any number of things, one of which being freedom. In mid December, a small collection of Jews and other miscreants were brought down Munich Street again to Dachau. Parade number 3. Rudy walked purposefully down Himmel Street and returned from number 35 with a small bag and two bikes. You game, Samich? The contents of Rudy's bag: six stale pieces of bread, broken into quarters. They pedaled ahead of the parade toward Dachau and stopped at an empty piece of road. Rudy passed Liesel the bag. Take a handful. Not sure this is a good idea. He slapped some bread onto her palm. Your papa did. How could she argue? Was worth a whipping. If we're fast, we won't get caught. He started distributing the bread, so move it, Samich. Liesel couldn't help herself. There was a trace of a grin on her face, and she and Rudy Steiner, her best friend, handed out the pieces of bread on the road. When they were finished, they looked like they took their bikes and hid among the Christmas trees. The road was cold and straight. It wasn't long till the soldiers came with the Jews. In the tree shadows, Liesel watched the boy. How things had changed from fruit stealer to bread giver. His blond hair, although darkening, was like a candle. She heard his stomach growl, and he was giving people bread. Was this Germany? Was this Nazi Germany? The first soldier did not see the bread. He was not hungry. But the first Jew saw it. His ragged hand reached down and picked up a piece and shoved it deliriously to his mouth. Is that Max? Liesel thought. She could not see properly and moved to get a better view. Hey! Rudy was livid. Don't move! They find us here. They match us to the bread. We're history. Liesel continued. More Jews were bending down and taking bread from the road and from the edge of the trees. The book thief examined each and every one of them. Max Vandenberg was not there. Relief was short lived. It stirred itself around her just as one of the soldiers noticed a prisoner drop a hand to the ground. Everyone was ordered to stop. The road was closely examined. The prisoners chewed as fast and silently as they could. Collectively, they gulped. The soldier picked up a few pieces and studied each side of the road. The prisoners also looked. In there! One of the soldiers was striding over to the girl by the closet trees. Next, he saw the boy. Both began to run. They chose different directions under the rafters of branches and tall ceiling of the trees. Don't stop running, Liesel. What about the bikes? Scheiß drauf. Shit on them. Who cares? They ran, and after 100 meters, the hushed breath of the soldier drew closer. It sidled up next to her, and she waited for the accompanying hand. She was lucky. All she received was a boot up the ass and a fistful of words. Keep running, little girl. You don't belong here. She ran and did not stop for at least another mile. Branches sliced her arms, pine cones rolled at her feet, and the taste of Christmas needles chimed inside her lungs. A good 45 minutes had passed by the time she made it back, and Rudy was sitting by the rusty bikes. He'd collected what he left of the bread and was chewing on the stale, stiff portion. Told you not to get too close, he said. She showed him her backside. Have I got a footprint? And that's the reading for today. We will talk again on Thursday.